Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas, on Sunday, October the 20th. And this is a topic today that we're going to be touching on. I find myself in an almost unbelievable, almost like Twilight Zone moment of what is happening in Cuba. As I wrote, or as I mentioned in my video yesterday, and I have a post coming out tomorrow at American Thinker about this, recalling the missile crisis and all of that, even though I've lived here for a long time in the United States, because of my parents, we were always very close to Cuba and always growing up, very, very close to the situation in Cuba. My parents always reminded us of where we came from and why we should always, remain very Cuban in our approach. I became a citizen of the United States and love the United States of America, as many of you know. But I still have this great love for Cuba and what it means to me. So when I see that the island of Cuba is literally out of lights because the power plants don't work and people are in the streets protesting and things are just almost like out of the Twilight Zone. I just don't know how else to explain it. When I see this, well, I wanted to bring on our program today one of our favorite people, someone who knows a great deal about Cuba because she left Cuba not long ago, and that is our dear friend Mailyn Salabarria. So, Mailyn, it is such a great honor to have you. Difficult topic, I know, for you, I'm sure, and for all of us. But let's begin by just talking a little bit about you and your Cuban story and when you came to the United States. And let's begin with that, please.
Well, it's so good to see you again. Thank you,
Yes,
Silvio, for the invitation. I
my
always
pleasure.
appreciate it. As we have explained your audience and your listeners before, I was born in Cuba, made in the US, have been very fortunate to be in this country since 2001, but I still have family and, my entire life roots back on the island. And given the turn that my professional career have taken in the last few years, I find myself more and more often talking about the real issues and the real story of what's happening in Cuba, which is, by the way, the testimonies, the facts, and the statistics that no media nowhere in the world, including the United States, is going to tell you when we're talking about the real Cuba and what is happening on the island.
Right. Now, so interesting point. You still have family in Cuba.
I
How
do,
many
yes.
family members do you have down there?
I have probably close to 10
Oh, wow.
plus, really close, longtime friends, neighbors, and people, that I grew up with. You got to remember, I left Cuba at age 27. So almost my entire, the first phase of my entire adult life, I was born and raised there.
Right. Yeah, a much different story than mine, of course, because I left
Hmm.
when I was 12, obviously.
Yeah.
So, I didn't have the experience that you had. Now, this situation with the lights is so bizarre, or the electricity is so bizarre. I just saw a headline before we started that another plant or something, I think they call it El Plan de Oriente or whatever it is, has
Hmm.
collapsed. So once again, there are no lights tonight in Cuba for much of the island, probably all of it. And there's a hurricane about to hit Oriente if it
Hmm.
hasn't hit Oriente already.
Yes.
So, first of all, let's talk about the problem itself. Obviously, what we're seeing here is a collapse of socialism, really, just another socialist failure. But these plants, now, most of these plants, where are they and what can you tell us about these plants, and were they the plants that were built before Castro or after Castro? What can you say about these plants, these power plants, that
Yeah,
is?
I think it's really important. Let's unpack the headlines a
Yes,
little bit
please.
because, like we have been talking for a while. There is different phases of these stories that goes beyond the headlines, and obviously the mainstream media most likely is not going to tell you what it is. You have to keep in mind. Problem number one is that most of the power generation type of facilities that we have had in Cuba for all these years were built before 1959. Most of them, when Castro took over, he just took over, the operation of those plants for whoever was the private company that owned them before. Needless to say, we know how collectivism and socialism, how efficient they are at maintenance, innovation, and keeping up with technology. So they have been basically running almost most of all these years, never at 100% capacity. And right now, what we're seeing is like the most heartbreaking example of why centralized socialist economic system simply do not work. So when you have those plants built before 1959 and you have a system that is so utterly inefficient, again, at everything that has to do with innovation, new technology, maintenance, supplies, including oil supply, they have basically been trying to keep their heads above the water for 65 years. Like in my case, when I left Cuba in 2001, it was part of my daily life that we will have blackouts. There was always a reason. There was never a moment in my entire life in Cuba that I remember that we would not have some sort of crisis that would cause some sort of blackouts. Needless to say, they will always prioritize Havana and the bigger suburbs and high demographic concentration cities to do the shortest blackouts. And then the biggest, the worst part of those power outage will always affect rural cities, rural areas, and the smaller or the lower density population centers in the entire island.
Now, let me just ask you a couple of questions that come to mind, not so much from a political standpoint, but just kind of my own business background. They're just questions that come to mind. These power plants, if they were the original power plants, meaning the ones built before Castro, they were run by American companies. I don't remember. I think that there was an American electric company in Cuba. I don't remember exactly what their name was. I've heard from my parents that it was an American company, very well-run company, like most American things were. And so if these are the power plants that operated in Cuba and they need to be updated, meaning the parts need to be updated, they could very easily go around the embargo and get those parts, because those parts would be available in Mexico, for example. There is a second market for these parts, much like there is for automobile parts or any aircraft parts or whatever. So it's not that, I heard Diaz-Canel say that this is all the consequence of the embargo. I mean, as far as I know, they could find these parts. They easily could have found these parts in many, many countries. So that's not really an excuse. I mean, they were not updated because they weren't updated, not because they couldn't get parts. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the best way that I have to explain it to you, because by the way, we'll get at some point to the Diaz-Canel excuses. I got the receipts to prove it why. But thinking in the audience of our fellow average American that might be listening to this story, this is the way that I find is the easiest for people outside of Cuba or outside of any connection to Cuba to understand. The dirty mechanisms and moves that are happening here in the background is, think about reality TV shows. Think about your nearest or newest episode of a Desperate Housewife of, I don't know, Pueblo, Colorado. You reach a bilateral agreement with your sugar daddy, and you're going to get $50 million that are going to be earmarked to furnish your new mansion in your given neighborhood. But then you made the decision that you're going to use that money and spend it into lavish travel overseas to blow your great life on social media and maybe buying a couple of Gucci shoes and bags. And then when the other person that made that agreement with you comes to the house and find it empty and without furniture, what do? In your usual manipulative and gaslighting self, you find somebody else to blame. Right. This is exactly the dynamics that are happening here. There is no difference. And the bottom line is simply financial irresponsibility and financial neglect.
Right. So,
and obviously,
no, go ahead. No, go ahead. No, what I was going to say. So that to me answers the question beautifully. because what we have here is a situation where there was simply carelessness, and it's the byproduct of no accountability. I mean, the reason
Exactly.
that, I mean, for example, when we have an earthquake, I'm not so much an earthquake, but a hurricane, let's say in Houston, where we had one a couple of years ago, or sadly what we've seen in the Atlantic coast, the reason that they rush to get these power plants back running as soon as possible is because there's politicians who understand that they're being held accountable for how
Hmm.
quickly these power plants come back, because they're voters, after all, who are without lights, and they get angry at whoever the governor is if there are no lights. And I think that we see here another example of communism in Cuba. There's no accountability. I mean, what does Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, and all the other gang of the Moncada group,
Hmm.
or whatever they're called, or even Diaz Canel or his wife, what do they care about lights? They're going to have lights tonight. They're not going to have to
Exactly.
worry about
Yep.
lights. So this is, I think, another example of the lack of accountability of a communist
Hmm.
regime. This is why, these things happen. There is no way that this could ever happen in a country where you had the slightest form of accountability, Mailyn. I mean, this is, to me, it tells you everything you need to know about this corrupt dictatorship. They're going to have lights tonight. They're going to
Hmm.
get to watch the baseball game tonight at the Diaz-Canel residence. They're going to have air
Yeah.
conditioning, but not the average Cuban. So
y-
I'm glad you explained it, because people, I've heard many times people talk about the embargo, and I know you want to talk about that in a minute, but the embargo doesn't stop you from buying these spare parts in the open market, in whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in Brazil or China or whatever. There's plenty of
No,
aftermarket
no,
you
it
can get.
doesn't. Mm-mm.
Yeah. So
And
that
it's just excuses. It's just excuses that they
right.
have been using for the last 60 years.
Right. So
And you
the power plants are not working because they have not been maintained by a corrupt, unaccountable regime. That's it. It's not because they don't have
exactly.
any money, or because the embargo. They could have easily gone around the embargo and gotten this
Mhm.
part. So please continue with your presentation.
There is actually a second reason why the entire power grid is like, what people need to understand, that between 95 and 97% of the power grid in Cuba is completely off right now as we're sitting here speaking. There is also a second added layer to this problem, but it's also tied to financial incompetence and lack of accountability that you were saying, which is also the huge shortage of crude oil that is needed for these plants, that not even with the super good deals that they're getting from Maduro in Venezuela, they're not even able to keep up the super discounted prices that they were given by the Venezuelan regime. So you see in the news, oh, there is a shipment from Venezuela coming tomorrow, and there is going to be another coming in Tuesday. It's not going to make any difference. Those are little drops in the ocean, and
Right.
everything goes
Okay.
back to that financial irresponsibility.
Now let me ask you about this. What you just said is very interesting, because what is the problem, and you've answered it already, but I just want to make sure that I understood it correctly. Is the problem a lack of oil or lack of fuel, or is the problem plants that don't work? Because if it's a lack of
Both,
fuel, both. Okay. But the
both.
lack of
Mhm.
fuel, why do they have a lack of fuel? Is it who's not supplying fuel like they're supposed to? I thought
Because
that
it's
China
not a
was doing
shortage of
it.
no, it's not a shortage of supply. Is that Cuba is a terrible client when it comes to pay for their commercial obligations, and I have the receipts to prove it. Like I told you
Yes.
before, back in 2015, the Cuban government signed a bilateral agreement with Putin and the Russian government, where they were gonna get 200. I'm going to go back on my notes because I want to make sure I got the number right.
Go ahead.
1,200 millions of euros in a super advantage type of bilateral loan. And that money was going to be earmarked specifically to repair and update the technologies of all the power plants in the entire island. What happened with that money? very quietly, about 3 or 4 years ago, the Ministry of the Energy Department in Cuba said that they couldn't finalize or execute the agreement because the Cuban government could not come up with the 10% required down payment that Putin was asking for. Though clearly somebody has to pay for the Rolex that Diaz-Canel wears, and somebody have to pay for the Ferragamo shoes and the designer's handbags that her wife is flaunting all over the world. Right there, that's why I thought, I'm like, the desperate housewife example is
Right.
going to be the perfect picture to explain this disaster.
Yeah, we sure have a very well-dressed Cuban first lady, don't we? Yeah, we have a Cuban, very well-dressed Cuban first lady, that's for sure. And Diaz-Canel looks good in all those suits that he wears. But let me ask you. I mean, this all of this is so amazing to me. You mentioned something that Cuba's a bad client. Why in the world? I mean, I think I know the answer, but please tell me, why in the world is Cuba such a bad client? I mean, they have sugar, they have mineral resources. Why cannot Cuba pay its bills, especially when the lenders are so generous? They keep restructuring the loans. I mean, Mexico keeps forgiving their loans. So what's the problem? Is basically Cuba down to being nothing but an economy that is based on, I hate to say it this way because it's horrible, because I know it affects young women, but an economy based on prostitution and these
And
people who come
tourism.
to as
Yep.
tourists, where they stay. Yeah, but I mean,
It's
why is Cuba such a bad country, or not a bad country, such a bad client to pay off its bills? What can you say about
very,
that?
very simple question that it also sits on two very simple reasons. Number one, centralized control of the economy doesn't work. It's inefficient, it stifles innovation, and it causes a whole sort of chain reaction problems. That's why socialist economies and socialist countries are always bankrupt unless they have a direct pipeline to cover up their inefficiency and the utter lack of being able to do anything right, like happened in Cuba when the Soviet Union was still in place. They're always going to be bankrupt. And the second part of this, Silvio, is the one that is, think about it like a toxic relationship. For you to have a bad payer, a bad client, a person that continue to circle the wagons around you to convince you that they are the victim, that everything bad that happens to them is to blaming to someone else, you need to have an enabler. You need to have someone willing to forget the background and the credit score of that client and continue to follow for the same trap. The Putin government did 3 or 4 years ago, readjust the external debt that the Cuban government have with them. And still, yet, look at what we are today. You saw the news of the socialist Mexican president saying that she was going to offer something similar. I hope, for the sake of Mexican taxpayers, that at least she's going to ask for a down payment. And mark my words, the Cuban government will not be able to come up with that money either. Again, why? Because collectivist, centralized economy does not work, period.
Right. That's right. Now, of course, if I understand the deal that Mexico is going to be offering Cuba, it's $20 million. That sounds to me like a drop of water. I mean, a drop in the ocean. Because I mean, I think that redoing all these plants is going to take a lot more than $20 million. And so, I mean, I think that's just the president of Mexico trying to be relevant in this story, because $20 million is not going to get you very far. But I just think, you were using the example of desperate housewives, and another example that has always come to mind about Cuba is the kid who was always depending on somebody to support them, whether it's the parents, whether it's the grandparents, and then eventually one day they have to make it on their own, and they cannot make it on their own. They just don't seem to have the ability to sustain themselves. So what happens? I mean, I know we have a lot of stuff going on at the same time. So what happens now? Because I've been watching all these videos, and by the way, we're going to be running this on the Babalu blog later. And the Babalu blog is doing a fantastic job. My good friend Alberto and my other good friend Carlos, they're doing a great job updating the situation as much as they can. But I've seen videos of people out in the streets. I've seen, women marching, making sounds with their kitchen utensils and so on. Where is this going to go? I mean, there's simply, is the regime perhaps, is this it? Is the, almost poetic justice that the regime would run out of lights or run out of electricity, and the lights literally went out on the regime, Mailyn?
Well, we can only hope. The only thing that I can tell you for sure is that this is ground zero, again, using these parallels and these comparisons that we have been discussing before, is that, Silvio, at some point in life, life will catch up with you. And at some point, you're going to be dealing with the consequences of your actions and your behaviors, whether you like it or not. Like this Cuban economist that I was reading the news this morning, he used the phrase energetic or energy bankruptcy. We have reached the point of ground zero of energy bankruptcy in Cuba, and the Cuban government has nobody else to blame but themselves. Now, what happens now? Sadly, the sad part of this, accountability, hard life lesson that they are receiving right now is that we have 11 million of Cubans that are paying the consequences of these failed policies of the corruption and the manipulation. And literally, it's like financial abuse type of actions, what we're talking about here, that the Cuban government has been inflicting over 11 millions of Cubans on the island for more than 65 years. What happens now? Yes, there might be civil unrest. Granted, we have gotten the news that already people taking the streets in Guantanamo, in Santiago de Cuba, Bahia, Alamar, like the eastern suburbans where the working class live in Cuba. But then you have the other layer, not only of the censorship, but how energy and electricity plays an important role in the information flow. ETEXA is the electric and internet IT company controlled by the Cuban government that provides everything that has to do with phones, cell phone services, and internet. They are special stations where they spread the signal for the internet and all that. They work with a special type of generations that are connected to the national power grid. So even the little videos and the things that we're seeing on the internet, the lives and all that, it's only the people that are able to get to the hotels and to the tourist resorts, because clearly they don't have blackouts and they do have internet, but not every Cuban has the money to pay for that connection and be able to send a live or send a video. So that's going to be another layer of, censorship and issues for the information to get out of the island for us outside the world to know what's really happening, which immediately makes me think, it's like, where is Elon Musk and his Starlinks when you need him the most?
Right. Yeah.
But this is what happening. And then everything is closed. Schools were canceled since Friday or Thursday. Everything that is not essential is closed. A few hospitals are running on generators, but I don't think they're not gonna be able to hold up that more than a week, Silvio. There is a big concern, especially with hospitals and essential services. Back in the mid 2000s, there was a huge problem in Cuba with the lack of energy, the blackouts and all that. And there was this hospital in Havana, it's a maternity hospital, where the generation blew up after a week of being as a backup, and about 10 or 12 preemies died in the NICU. And I know this story because I have a close source whose name I shall not repeat that was in there. And they tried to blame it on the doctors and they tried to paint it as a malpractice and whatnot, when at the end, it was a failure of the power service in that hospital and how they rely on generator for so long, what killed 12 babies that were on incubators in the NICU. Needless to say, the same thing is already happening. Number one, they don't have a plan. In the remarks that Diaz-Canel did yesterday or the day before, he was just literally beating around the bushes, but there was no deadline, no direct plan. We're working on it. We're doing this. I'm going to do that. And then trying, to keep everybody in that same limbo. Number two, like you said, we have the hurricane coming. It's supposed to hit Santiago de Cuba and the coastal areas of Guantanamo tonight. And clearly, everything is the fault of the embargo and the evil American empire. I mean, at some point, we need to get out of this toxic relationship. We need to leave these narcissists behind and start telling people that everything bad that happens to them is nothing but their own doing. It's not the blame and it's not the fault of the rest of the world.
Absolutely. No, I think you're exactly right. And by the way, when Diaz-Canel I guess he went on television to explain or come up with the excuses. In your estimation, how many Cubans were able to see that? Because in most parts, they didn't have electricity. The other day, I had a conversation.
I know.
I mean, I'm sitting there. This guy is on TV. Who can watch him?
And probably not many.
That was my reaction to it. Okay, you're on TV explaining what's going on. 90% of the island cannot watch you. I was talking the other day. Kind of a unique situation here in Dallas, where there's a young woman who is a student at the community college where I teach, and she wanted me to meet her mom, who was in Cuba. So she put her mom on the iPhone,
Mm-hmm.
And this is a little bit before all of this stuff happened. And the mom was saying that they're getting electricity 2 hours a day, and that was optimistic, But I'm just sitting there saying, if, for example, if somebody could actually, come up with a plan tonight, we have a few minutes left. But if I came to you and I said, okay, let's come up with a plan tonight, what would it take? Is it fair to say that it would take maybe a year and a half, because you're going to have to literally rebuild all those facilities, update all those facilities? Would it take thousands of generators brought into the island? I mean, I don't see any easy solution here. As long as this regime is holding on to power, seems like the regime wants to hold on to power at whatever cost, including including what we're watching. I mean, when again, I go back to the example of the hurricanes. When we have a hurricane, the first person who is interested in fixing the problem is the governor, because he doesn't want to get blamed for the problem. And here, it just strikes me that Diaz-Canel doesn't care, because he's going to have lights tonight. His family is going to have lights, and he's not accountable for anything. Now, I hear people I hear people are marching in the streets, and hopefully that's the beginning. I heard somebody say that what we need in Cuba is, maybe a military uprising that literally throws out these bums and calls out for international help, and then maybe the United States could step in and, somehow take care of the generator problem. I'm being a bit optimistic, perhaps, but I don't see any solution from within the island, Mailyn. That's what I see is people just blaming it on the embargo.
Yeah, it's a very, very hard predicament. I'm so, it makes me laugh every time that you say about how elected officials all over the world are being held accountable. That's never happened. That's never going to happen in Cuba, Silvio. Number one, we are starting on a flawed premise, because we know that the elections in a uniparty, communist-controlled society are just a clown show. Number two, Diaz-Canel is a clown that was not even elected. He was literally designated to be the heir of the slave plantation that Fidel Castro and Raul Castro left behind. And then number two, rebuilding a country like Cuba in the conditions that it is right now, in my very, uneducated opinion in that case, I think it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. Clearly, there's going to have to be some movement and some energy from within the island. If at some point the military could understand what is happening to the rest of the population and could be on their side, that would be ideal. You got to remember that firearms and weapons were forbidden by the Castro government almost immediately after they took over. The problem is that they have the military, in the sugar daddy loop too. We know that the higher, elite of the military in Cuba right now, they do have electricity. Their food is not rotting right now in their refrigerators, and they do have internet. It's your average Cuban Joe, Silvio, the one that is paying the higher price from this disaster.
Well, the Cuban soldiers who are supporting this underneath, and I keep thinking to myself, Batista was a sergeant in 1933. He wasn't one of the top ranking ones.
Mm-hmm.
If maybe there's I don't know, some kind of a Batista at the moment, but there are no easy solutions.
No,
let me ask you, we have my family, because we've been gone so long. I have a cousin in Cuba. That's all I have. Direct family, other indirect family, but we still have a cousin who lives in Ciego de Avila. Who grew up with us. You have family and friends there. Have you been in touch with any of them? Have any of them sent you any video, any messages?
Yes, I have.
Can you share any of that?
I'll be happy to share. I just got a couple of hours ago an audio via WhatsApp explaining some friends that live on the eastern side of Havana, explaining what was the situation, how they're trying to, get the big plants back up, and they keep failing. They keep failing because now you don't not only you have an old system that has been lacking the proper maintenance, but also all of the sudden you caught and have been rationing for too long the crude oil supply that they need to keep these plants, working properly the way that they are supposed to. So there is definitely a lot of concern. We are talking about a country and a situation that have been getting only worse lately. People that are struggling to find food, and then whatever you can find, which is, by the way, bought in the black market, if you're lucky enough to have family abroad to send you some money to do it, and then you have been more than 3 days without power now. All your food is going to go bad. Medications, like I said, hospitals and people that might need urgent medical attention. This is at the brink of becoming a humanitarian crisis, Silvio, and nobody is having the courage to say so.
Right. And I would wish, if I had the president of Mexico next to me, I would say, look, thanks for the money, but sending the money without calling for major changes in Cuba is simply, not resolving the problem. I mean, it's not a lack of money. It's a lack of a regime that needs to be changed. Well, I don't know what to say. I want to thank you so much.
I was going to say that sending money. Yeah, send the message and put it out because, again, we, the ones that are outside of Cuba, we, the ones that literally have power and internet, we need to become the voices of those ones that are being silenced inside the island. Do not believe what the clowns of the government are telling you, because that is not the reality. We need to find ways to expand and spread the voice and the messages of the people that are actually living the consequences of these decisions made by the Cuban government.
Right. And I would also, in whatever way I can, I would call on tourists in Cuba who are sitting in those hotel rooms and maybe can see the marches. I don't know how far they are from the people, but a lot of those tourists with their iPhones can do for the world a tremendous service here, and getting those videos out, because they're not going to run out of electricity from what you're saying.
Absolutely, yes.
And they're going to have internet. So those tourists, there's got to be some good people among those tourists. Probably most of them are good people who can see for themselves what is going on. It reminds me of a story of when a friend of mine from Mexico went to Cuba, and he didn't really have any political orientation when he went. He just took advantage of a cheap trip, because the trips were very cheap. This was about the year 2000, and he said when he went to Cuba that when he was leaving and he was talking to the young woman who was cleaning his room, he felt so bad for them that he literally left just about everything. All the toiletries that he and his wife had brought. I mean, they just said, look, take this. You need it more than I do. I can get another, I can buy deodorant when I get back to Mexico, but you guys need it more than I do. And I think there must be a lot of tourists. I would have to think, good people who are down there probably because there was a cheap trip, who are watching all of this and saying, we could we could have an impact on the world by telling the world what's going on. But I got to tell you this. This is just as a closing thought. Who would have believed? Who would have believed? You know, both of my parents have now passed away. You know, I came with them from the United States. But I mean, I just think that people of that generation who left Cuba, like my parents, have got to be looking at all this and saying, who would have believed any of this? Who would have believed that the Cuba that they knew would be like this? This is almost like something out of it. I don't know. Is there a book ever written about stuff like this? Maybe, I don't know.
There are plenty of books that were considered utopic fictional novels that seems that the Cuban government used them as implementation manuals, but that's a conversation for another time.
Yes, and by the way, I want to thank you so much because you're at an airport and you're, as they say, at an airport, and I want to thank you so much that you found a little room to talk to us. And I would only ask you a favor, and that is, can we do this more often? Because you are well connected, you have information, and I know myself and the audience and our good friends at Babalu who will watch this later, they love to hear what you say. So please,
absolutely,
anytime you want to be on, just you know how easy it is to do this. So you call me and we'll figure it out. But listen, I want to thank you so much. You are so informative and so much fun to talk to, and I wish we had something more pleasant to talk about, but
I know it's sad, but it's important. It's important that someone has the courage, again, like I said earlier, to become the voice of those that are being silenced in Cuba, of those that are actually suffering the consequences of the corruption and the financial mismanagement of these people that have been in power for too long. And regarding the invitation, I am here every time you need me to go Cuban nuclear on anybody that is circled the wagons and putting any fake stories out there. I'm your huckleberry.
Well, I am always happy to have you drop nuclear bombs on our communist friends. So you have all the communist, I mean, not communist friends, but our communist enemies, I guess, in the sense of Cuba. But we'll probably have to do it again this week because this is changing.
Absolutely. This is good. Yeah, this is going to be something changing pretty quick. And again, something that somebody needs to start paying attention to and hopefully come together to do something positive to help the people that are actually suffering the consequences.
Oh, my God. And are they ever suffering consequences? It is not. I mean, when you said suffering consequences, underline it, put 6 exclamation marks. Because you're talking about suffering some real consequences. This is no longer the lights going out 2 hours like you remember. No. This is not like tarjeta de racionamiento that at least I remember.
Yeah,
no, this is real people suffering. I mean, you got babies.
This is game over. This is game over. And if there is one thought that I want your listeners or your audience to remember from this conversation is that this is not about the embargo. This is not about anything else but the utter incompetence of a communist dictatorship. Why? Because they have chosen a centralized economic system that does not work. And whoever tells you otherwise is also gaslighting you and manipulating their reality in your eyes.
Absolutely. As I say, go to Cuba and find out how well it works.
Yeah,
that's what you got to do. Assuming that there are lights to go to Cuba. Right now, they cannot go to Cuba. Which is, by the way, if I may just say something really quickly, I understand. I saw a story that Air Canada is canceling flights because how are you going to go to an island without lights?
Havana International Airport was shut down yesterday for more than 12 hours. So yeah, there are a lot of flights, international flights that have been canceled. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, imagine somebody saying, "Hey, let's go to our honeymoon to a place where the lights don't work." I think that might be a little too spooky for most.
Yeah, right. Even for Halloween.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think a lot of women would say, "Wait a minute, I thought it was a romantic honeymoon." Total darkness is not what I was hoping for. Well, thank you so much. And please stay in touch. And thank you as always for your time.
Will do. Thank you again for the invitation. It's a very important message that, I believe we need to keep putting out. There is no time to rest when it comes to putting out the truth and the reality about Cuba.
No, I need you to go nuclear very often on Cuba. Well, thank you so much. You have a wonderful day. All right, our good friend Mailyn Salabarria. You know, this whole topic is absolutely beyond explanation. I mean, I just, you know, it doesn't, it would have never occurred to me the many times that I would speak with my late parents about Cuba and how bad things were down there and talk to people. Something like this was just something completely out of the radar. But as our friend Mailyn was saying, this is what happens when you have an economy like this. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. And those of you over at Babalu, thank you for your time. And by the way, keep up those great articles at Babalu. You're doing all of us who don't live in Miami and don't have all this access like you do. You're keeping us informed. So thanks to my friends at Babalu, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. Have a good day, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas.